Hi, everybody. Good afternoon to you. First of all, let me just thank Jen H. for putting this on today and inviting me to participate, and thank all of you for blocking out this much time on this subject matter. That's very impressive. It's a lot of hours. There's a lot of demands on your time, so thank you for committing so much time today. I'm charged with trying to do a quick overview of affordable housing development, and I have probably around 30 minutes of prepared comments, so I'm leaving an hour's time slot, so I'm leaving lots of time for you to ask questions and have a conversation. So at any time, just raise your hand, interrupt me, whatever, I'm fine with that. So we'll just go at whatever pace you want in terms of questions and answers. Affordable housing development, I'm gonna focus on rental affordable housing. I'll touch a little bit on ownership, but I'm gonna focus on rental housing because that's where most of the money is, where most of the need is, where most of the action is. So we'll spend most of the time on rental housing, but just acknowledging there is affordable development for ownership projects out there. And as Stephanie introduced me, I'm currently a Burbank employee, been working for 10 years. Burbank is Santa Rosa-based nonprofit, develops in Sonoma County and Napa Valley, Napa County. And we're starting to do a little bit of work in Marin, but mostly our work is here in Sonoma County. I think we have 4 or 5 projects in Napa. So again, we'll focus on rental housing, and within that, the main complexity, the main task to get affordable housing done is braiding together the financing sources. So I'll probably spend a disproportionate amount of time talking about the funding streams and how they relate. But in order just to kind of organize my comments, I'm going to kind of argue that there's 3 main ways, or not ways, 3 main categories of this work to develop affordable housing. And it's just my way of organizing this. Someone else might look at it differently, but I'm going to break this into kind of 3 sections. So the first section is site acquisition, which includes land use approvals, environmental clearance, as well as actually acquiring sites. And then the second area I'm going to talk about in sequence is assembling financing. Like I said a minute ago, that's really the main complexity. That's where the real heavy lifting is. And in the third category, I'm going to kind of lump a few things together here and call it programming and design. And what I mean by programming is if you're building a new or even a repurposed rental housing project, who are you targeting? What income levels are you targeting? Homeless people, agricultural workers, elderly. So that's what I mean by programming. It's like the tenant targeting. And design, and by design I mean just that, the architectural and engineering aspects. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is again site acquisition, land use approvals, environmental clearances. And I'll start out by saying this is not Burbank's model, my current employer. I keep saying current employer, by the way, because I've announced my retirement. So 5 weeks from today, I'm done. So that's why I keep saying current. It's not that I'm about to change jobs, I'm about to leave the workforce. So, which means I'm completely unfettered. I'll just say anything today. So, I'll just, wherever the bodies are buried, I'll let you know. So, but seriously, site acquisition, let's talk about that for a second. Some developers, their business model is to only look at sites that are completely and fully entitled with all the land use permissions for what they want to do. So if they wanted to build an apartment, in that model, they only look at things that are zoned to do what they want to do. The advantage of that model, it's not common, but there are developers, that's their business model. The advantage is kind of obvious, right? You don't have to spend the time and cost and uncertainty of getting entitlements in place. They're already in place. The negative part of that business approach is you're going to really limit the sites that are available to you because you just aren't going to find that many that are zoned exactly for what you want to do. And you're going to pay a lot more for that real estate. So that's kind of the trade-off there. Burbank and most developers, I would say, don't do that. They will tie up a property and then they'll work through the land use and environmental clearances. And I think maybe in other segments today you've touched more on the land use and entitlement pieces, but I'll just kind of walk through from a developer's point of view. For affordable housing, again, kind of focused on rental housing, there's lots of land use permissions we may or may not need depending on the site. We might have to work with the jurisdiction on general plan consistency. If the site happens to be in a specific plan area, we'd have to work, to get in compliance with a specific plan or change the specific plan. Zoning, of course, that's another land use piece to work on. Design review is another one, another process. If you're in a historic district, there might be another process around cultural preservation, historic district. And then there's environmental reviews. The CEQA is the state process. And I'm kind of assuming that some of these terms are familiar, but if I'm mistaken, if I'm using any jargon or acronyms today, just stop me and I'll explain it. I don't expect everyone will be conversant with real estate and finance terms. I'm doing my best to avoid jargon, but if I drop the ball, just say, what do you mean by that? But so everyone knows what CEQA means? Yeah, okay. Some of you know it because that's your full-time job perhaps, but anyway, CEQA compliance is a big time-consuming, complex piece. There's environmental review at the federal level if there are federal funds involved, and there often is, and that's the NEPA, environmental review. So affordable housing developers are typically doing both. And those processes, as most of you know, some of you know anyway, can take months, typically years, to get through that. And there's typically 6-digit costs associated with hiring the lawyers and consultants and whatever to go through those processes to get you in front of the Planning Commission, in front of the City Council, and so on, to get these land use approvals in place. So it's time-consuming and pretty expensive. And just as a quick sidebar, and this is something a lot of you already know, but for CEQA, if you're going to be sued by neighbors or other opponents to your proposal, the most likely argument is going to be your CEQA review was inadequate or inappropriately scoped, just basically flawed in some way. Excuse me. So what a lot of developers do is we'll do a full EIR, environmental impact report, which is the kind of the highest level of analysis. We'll do that even though arguably there are lesser processes we could have gone through, but in fear of litigation, you often do a full environmental impact report because then you have more of an argument to defeat that litigation. So it's typical to do a full-blown environmental assessment, even though again maybe technically you wouldn't have to go to that extent, but it's part of thinking about defeating litigation, because litigation can add another 6-digit cost in another couple of years, and so we're very sensitive to that. And this next thing I'm going to say has to do with legislation in California the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years. Maybe you've touched on this other parts today, so excuse me if I'm repeating stuff, but there's been legislation the last half dozen years which is kind of taking some of the discretion away from local jurisdictions and allowing developers in some circumstances to develop by right, meaning there's no discretionary approval sought after with the local jurisdiction. From a developer standpoint, I realize who I'm talking to, but from a developer standpoint, sure, we're always looking for a way to mitigate the uncertainty and the time. So, we jump on those opportunities. Burbank in the last few years has done several projects that took advantage of some of that new legislation that let us really develop by right. So that's huge. And again, I know who I'm talking to, but from a developer point of view, we have welcomed that. And also in some of that legislation I'm referring to, the CEQA requirement has been waived. And so that's another way that we can really expedite it and move quicker and with a lot less cost. So what I'm talking about here in terms of getting these land use requirements in place applies equally to rental as well as ownership projects. But with rental projects, there's much more likelihood that we're going to have to address parking limitations from our point of view, developer point of view. You know, the parking requirements come up with rental properties in a way they wouldn't probably with ownership. Height, building height, you know. So there's when you do rental housing as opposed to ownership housing, you tend to have a lot more need to go through more elaborate city processes or county processes. Ownership, typically, there's not that many elements to tackle. And I wanted to say this next part is probably might be a surprise to you. I don't think it's intuitive or obvious, but in practice, nonprofit developers and maybe for-profit affordable housing developers, but I'm really thinking about nonprofit developers, we tend to land on sites that are not marketed in the open market. You know, I'm on all these email lists that I'm always seeing someone's trying to sell some land. You know, commercial real estate brokers have lots of land for sale. It's fairly uncommon for nonprofit affordable housing developers to get sites that way. We're more likely to get sites because there's a master developer over here doing a large neighborhood and they have an inclusionary requirement, and they don't really know how to build or finance that kind of housing product because it's not what they do. Maybe they'll partner with the Burbanks of the world to do the affordable housing basically on their behalf to meet the inclusionary requirements. That's not uncommon. Another way that we end up acquiring sites is you know, just development partners or other nonprofits have properties that they want to develop. Sometimes in my last 10 years, I've probably heard about half a dozen churches, as an example, that have vacant land, and it's like, well, we should do something for affordable housing. And often when we talk to them, we don't intend to do this, but we scare them away because it's so complicated. So those don't materialize frequently, but occasionally land sites are acquired from churches or nonprofits. Also, city and county government surplus land or land that is no longer used, you know, that's another source. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's fairly uncommon for us to go out and just acquire property from commercial brokers who are trying to sell property. It's usually there's some sort of relationship or community focus already in place. And the reason behind that, in my personal opinion, is it takes so long to get affordable housing through the pre-development stage, to get it going. You can't reasonably go to a commercial broker and say, could we have a 9-month escrow? You know, it takes so long. You almost always need the landowner to in some way be your partner. So I don't know if that is obvious or not, but I wanted to touch on that. I was thinking back last night when I was thinking about this presentation, like I couldn't come up with a single Burbank property that we actually acquired from a broker trying to sell property. It's almost always some other kind of community connection. And it's, again, driven by how long it takes to get these things done. Sometimes, and I'm going to talk quite a bit more about funding sources in a minute, but sometimes funding sources themselves drive what we're buying. A really good example of that in California right now, there's the Home Key funding program of the state. Many of you are nodding, you're familiar with that. It's not, the Home Key funding program from state HCD, it's not exclusively for acquiring hotels and motels, but it's tailored for that purpose. And so at Burbank, as an example, in the last 5 years, we probably have acquired or are in the process of acquiring around half a dozen motels to convert to homeless housing. So that's kind of an example of where the funding sources, you know, they're not saying you must do a motel conversion, but it's tailored for that purpose. And so this is really good news if you happen to own a motel or hotel, because the prices have gone through the roof statewide because nonprofits like Burbank are trying to buy motels. I haven't mentioned yet that in affordable housing, you know, this is kind of a basic concept, but sometimes we're doing new construction from ground up, and sometimes we're acquiring something with a motel, for example, or other buildings and converting them. And the land use processes whether it's new construction or repurposing buildings, is pretty much the same. It tends to be more issues to deal with when it's new construction because it's probably more entitlement pieces that you have to change as opposed to an existing building. So now I'm going to move to assembling the finance. Remember a minute ago I said that I was kind of breaking this into three components. Just finished the first one, which was entitlements, land use, acquisition. The second one is assembling the financing, and that's the piece that takes the most time and effort and is by far the most complex piece of the process. And it usually takes a couple of years. I can't think of any projects offhand that I've been involved with for decades that took less than 2 years. And some of them actually never get done. You know, you take 5 years to assemble financing or 6 years and you can't do it, maybe you abandon it. So, I mean, but typically it's, I would say 2 to 4 years in most cases is how long it takes to put your financing together. The tricky part is the permanent financing, and I'll get more into that in a second, but just you know, to finish the picture, we also have to acquire the construction financing. So we're simultaneously, when we have a project on the drawing board, looking for a construction lender. That's usually far easier. And then we're also looking for various permanent sources of funding for the permanent financing. So it's both of those things, but it's the permanent financing that's the real effort. No surprise to anyone in this room, all of the funding sources are horribly oversubscribed. They can't fund anywhere near the demand. And so what that means is the funders, that gives them an opportunity when they're figuring out how they're going to do a schema for scoring or rating, you know, how they're going to select applicants. That schema, because it's so hyper competitive, it allows them to add whatever features or preferences they want. So often, here's just some examples. You know, we're going to build this project, and we were going to just do what the local building code required in terms of energy conservation and sustainable materials. But this funder over here wants much more than what the local building code demands. So we'll do more energy conservation features. We'll do more sustainable materials in the design, because that's how you have to compete. You get more points for those kinds of things. Other examples of that, you know, meeting the needs of the funders include how you're income targeting. You know, in the development industry, we speak in terms of AMI, area median income. Does everyone know? Okay. And so, you know, some of the funders want to see us target really deeply meaning maybe 30% AMI or 40% AMI, under 50% AMI. So again, the funders can make these kind of demands that are not easy to meet because it's so competitive. They need some sort of schema to figure out who they're going to fund. So that's an example, is the targeting. And related to that, sometimes you get more points in your competition if you're going to provide housing for homeless people. Or that's particularly in the last few years, but things change over time, and I've been doing this a long time. You know, sometimes there was more of a focus on agricultural workers, and then that kind of fades a little bit. You know, disabled, victims of domestic violence. I mean, there's targeting preferences that the funders have that we react to and respond to. So when we Burbank, I guess is what I mean by we, when we build a project and it's has these income tiers in terms of targeting, maybe 2 or 3 levels, you know, different units at different incomes, and maybe it's homeless housing. We're making those decisions because that's where the funding is driving us. So the funders drive what gets built, and that's the simple way of saying it. A few more examples of things that we have to do to meet funder preferences is neighborhood amenities, like the tax credit program, which I'll talk about in a second in a little more detail. They want you to tell them how many miles your project is from elementary school, how many miles is your project from a hospital, how many miles is your project from retail, like grocery stores, basically. So you get scored on neighborhood amenities, which means, you know, we might come across a site, maybe someone wants to donate a beautiful site to us. It's possible we'll turn it down because it's too far from amenities and it won't score for funding, even though it's a lovely site and it's free in this imaginary example. So those, again, drive the selection of housing sites. Another example is the tax credit program, which again I'll circle back to, requires that your rental complex has a community room with certain things in it, and the community room has to be of a certain size related to the number of units you're building. So we will build a community room, which maybe we would have done that anyway, but you know, maybe not. So the funding sources are driving what we do and making affordable housing more costly to build than market housing, because we have to do community room, we have to do more sustainable energy, we have to do this and that. So affordable housing tends to cost more to build, in part because we're meeting the expectations of a host of funders. Typically, when we're doing a rental project, typically there's 7 to 10 funding sources. And some of those funding sources only have a competition once a year. Some of them have 2 or 3 a year, but usually it's a year. So you can understand if you have to assemble 6, 7, 8 funding sources to make your project pencil out, and they only have a competition once a year, it's going to take you some time. So that's why it takes so long to put the funding sources together. You guys are not asking questions, maybe, yes? Going too fast, maybe.
I was waiting to the end. So,
yeah, jump in.
You know, given the constraints of identifying some of these funding sources, what's happening with public-private partnerships? How, you know, with private money or private investment, has Burbank done a lot to try to identify those sources? Local investors, CDFIs, things like that?
Yes, I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but you know, Kaiser and Providence Health Systems are providing quite a bit of money. And I don't know if you consider that private investment, but they're not loans, they're not government loans. You know, it's grants for projects. They've really stepped up, and that's across the state. We've seen a lot of health system money going into affordable housing because there's a recognition that part of being well and healthy is having affordability in your housing. And so we see that's, you know, 10 years ago, if I was doing this, I wouldn't even think to talk about health systems, but they're a big investor now. And that's actually a nice segue, because I was about to talk about the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a form of, you could call it a form of private investment. So if I didn't adequately answer your question, just ask it again when I get done with that. Yeah.
This is kind of a correlated question, but when you say investment, is there a return for somebody somewhere? Or is this like an investment in your community kind of investment?
It's the latter. You know, right, affordable housing, the rents are low, right? That's the point. So the cash flow is minimum, and sometimes not, sometimes negative. So there just isn't much cash flow to give someone a normal kind of market return. Yeah, it's usually community oriented, or as I'm about to launch into tax credits. Yes?
So because of that, do projects have less amenities for people who are going to be living there? And do you have to now all of a sudden see the pretty balconies on this slide that you've got back there? That costs money.
Yeah.
To do that. And having, I mean, do we end up with like a sort of beehive sort of project where people don't have access to, you know, outdoor space because that costs money? Is that sort of part and parcel to like not having enough money to develop, and so then we need the housing, but we're gonna cut back on a simple thing like outdoor space?
I'm pausing because it's a complicated question. As I mentioned, as I was talking before this, this break with questions, the funders are really driving what gets built, and they often are looking for amenities that's ahead, sometimes on site. So we'll always have a community room because it's required. So those kind of amenities are going to happen because the funders are asking for it. There are other things that Burbank elects to do. One of the examples I'm going to talk about today is, I'll just tell you what it is right now. It's a project that started 3 years ago in downtown Santa Rosa, just not too many blocks from here actually, called Caritas Homes. Caritas Homes Phase 1, technically speaking. And that project, we designed it from the ground up. And it's 64 units, and about half of those units are for homeless people. And so it's nice to design things, new buildings, because you can sit down with a blank slate. But in that case, we add balconies, we have a large community room, we have a large outdoor socialization space, we built into the hallways. It's a 4-story building, and you walk down some of the halls on some of the floors, you'll see these little alcoves that we built as small places for people to gather and socialize, because we recognize that half of the units are going to be housing formerly homeless people, and there was a concern on our part about them being isolated, like not leaving their unit. So we went out of our way to do indoor and outdoor, large and small meeting spots. And so it took up a fair amount of real estate to do that, but that was our choice. This will sound like a biased statement, but what do I care? I'm retiring. For-profit tax credit builders, they tend to build, I think, what you were kind of alluding to, which is kind of bare bones, no frills, plain housing, the cheapest materials they can buy. That happens, I think, more on the for-profit side. Burbank has learned over the 40-some years of existence that it's actually economically wiser to use high-end materials because they last longer, and we don't have much budget for maintenance, because the rents are low, there isn't a lot of money to fix and replace. So we tend to build really high-end projects with high-end materials because it's actually, in the end, less costly. So that's a long answer. I hope that touched.
It does, and if I can just ask one more question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dominate the space. When you're saying that some of these projects don't cash flow, they're actually in the negative cash flow. Don't know how many of those are, but how are they sustaining? How are they going to sustain in 20 years in that environment?
We never design them to have red ink, but sometimes that happens, particularly with the homeless housing, because the costs are so extraordinary, operational costs. So we never go out expecting to lose money, but it does happen with, Burbank has 75 roughly apartments in the portfolio, and probably half a dozen of those bleed a little bit. I'm not going to say hemorrhage, but have some red ink. But it's made up because the other 65 or so, have a little bit of positive income. So the portfolio overall breaks even or better, but there are properties that do lose money, but never by design.
But aren't there opportunities to get grants for rehab and things like that as well that a nonprofit can go into to try to make up for that loss of money?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about replacing just red ink. If there's funding sources when it's time to do some capital improvements 15 years down the road or whatever, but I don't know of any funding sources that want to make you whole because you're bleeding. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions right now? Okay, I'm going to talk about one of the funding sources for affordable housing. It's the low-income housing tax credit. Came about when Reagan was president, I think his second term, so late 80s. So since the late 80s to now, nationwide, the low-income housing tax credit is by far the biggest funder of affordable housing by a landslide. I mean, I don't know what the exact figure is, but I'm sure it's 95% of every affordable housing apartment that's been built has tax credits as one of the financing sources. So it's huge. And everyone kind of falls in line behind that because, you know, what they want us to build is what we build, and everyone else sort of kind of falls in line. They're really the leader, and it's extraordinarily complex. And, you know, we could spend hours and hours talking about that complexity, but let me just try to summarize what the program does. So it's basically an IRS program at the federal level, providing federal income tax credits, not deductions, credits against your calculated liability, right? And it's administered at the state level. Even though it's a federal program, every state actually administers it for their state. In California, it's done by the Treasury at the state. It's a group within the Treasury called the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, TCAC. And the way it works is, in the most simple way, is nonprofit or for-profit developers compete for an allocation of tax credits, federal income tax credits. And the amount of the tax credits is proportional to the cost of your building. So, you know, 100 units is going to be twice the tax credits as 50 units, assuming the unit cost is similar. And if you apply for tax credits and you go through the competition and you are lucky enough to get an award, you don't typically, I mean, this would be rare that the applicant would actually want to use the tax credits for their own tax liability. In almost every instance, you essentially sell the tax credits. And right now, I would say 99% of the buyers of tax credits are banks. So let's just say everyone who does a tax credit investment is a bank, because it's pretty close to true. So Burbank gets an award of tax credits for a property, and we'll get 2 or 3 banks to give us a quote, because there's no fixed price for it. It's a market thing. It fluctuates with interest rates and tax code changes and so forth. So, you know, the market for tax credits changes over time. And so we'll, you know, solicit 2 or 3 banks, and we'll pick one generally who will pay the most for the tax credits. And so mechanically the way it works is Burbank, this is almost always the case, would own 0.01% of the project. The tax credit investor, the bank, owns 99.99%. And so they make a very large equity contribution as the owner, if you will, the limited partner owner, not the managing partner, but, you know, the silent partner, owning 99.99% of the building. I forgot what I was saying. Anyway, Burbank, you know, only owns this 0.01% because we're a nonprofit. We don't have a federal income tax to pay, so we can't use them. So that's why you sell virtually all of them to a bank who wants to use them. So in a minute, I'll go through the Caritas project, just walk through that real quick. But that's how the tax credit program works. And you can get, I don't know, 35 to 70% of the total cost of your project funded with that single source. There's a lot of variables, but you can easily cover half of your total development costs with that equity investment from the bank, which is great because it's not debt. There's no loan payments. The bank is the owner, in essence, of these projects. And the bank, the investor, needs to stay in as an investor for a minimum of 15 years. That's the IRS compliance period. And then the developer, Burbank, whoever, and the bank after year 15 are mutually motivated for the bank to leave. So they typically come in for that 15 years, and then there's kind of an exit strategy. And so if you look at Burbank's portfolio just as an example, if you look at properties that we've had, quite a while, we might own them outright, 100% ownership. But anything that's less than 15 years old, we'll have that minuscule ownership of 0.01%. And to your point about, fixing things up down the road, you can use tax credits on the front end for a new project, but you can also, at year 15 or year 20 or 25, when you need a new roof and a new boiler and whatever, we call it a resyndication. You can go back and you can apply for tax credits to do capital improvements for something that's already up and going. So that's how the tax program works. And one detail I should add is, even though the IRS compliance period is 15 years, and that's what the investors care about, the state, who administers tax credits for this state, says you're going to do this for 55 years. So we have a deed restriction, we have a regulatory agreement associated with the tax credit on every property saying you're going to do this for 55 years. So that's what the state of California did, even though the federal requirement is much less. I can go on and on about tax credits, but I don't want to, but if there's questions, yeah.
So you said that, if I heard you correctly, that for properties that are greater than 15 years of age, Burbank actually has ownership. And so one, I'm wondering, how did you get the funding for that ownership? And two, then if you own the building, and there's a 55-year deed restriction, would it be fair to say that if you own the building, that deed restriction could go on into perpetuity?
Yeah, yes. On the last question, effectively into perpetuity, because we're going to keep going after funding sources for capital improvements and repairs. That'll trigger usually, is that for me? Okay. That triggers 55 years every time. So yeah, plus Burbank's a nonprofit, so our mission is to do this. So even without the regulatory agreements, we'd probably be doing it into perpetuity. But
And your funding to purchase, how do you come about that?
you try to, these tax credit syndications, these agreements with the banks are very, very complex. And there's a whole industry that drafts them and stuff. And they're intended by design such that when the 15 years comes around, there'll be a lot of debt built up in a way that the bank will just walk. In other words, we don't have to buy it from the bank because we've built up this, I don't want to say artificial debt because it's not artificial, but it's tactical debt, I'll call it. And so that's how you try to design these partnerships, so that year 15 comes around, the bank is happy to walk because they got their tax credits, right? They got what they wanted. So they don't really have an economic interest after the tax credit period ends. So that's the short answer, is we don't typically have to buy them out. A narrow exception is sometimes maybe they didn't get the total tax benefits that they had anticipated, so maybe we have to pay a small amount to kind of make them whole, but basically they walk, yeah.
Can I, because I'm sitting here with my supervisor who approves my request to make investments in these, so I want to clarify, there is a difference with local money. When we invest our affordable housing funds in a Burbank project, we make a loan to Burbank for permanent financing with a 55-year deed restriction. We don't forgive our money. That money, hopefully, we want to be refinanced in perpetuity. We hope we never get the money back, but there is not that mechanism of forgiveness.
Right.
We don't ever forgive it. So
Right.
I just want to.
Right.
Hearing,
That's right.
Wait, what are we?
Yeah.
No, we're not there.
And that's a great segue, because the next thing I want to talk about is, tax credits is the main funding source, but it still leaves a huge gap, usually 50% or something of the deal. So then we go after city, county, state loans, and we call them soft loans, which means they're deferred payment loans. You don't have to service the debt unless there's positive cash flow that lets you do so. But if you don't have positive cash flow, or it's minuscule, you don't have to service that debt. So it's deferred by usually 20 years or 30 years. So we call those soft loans. So yes, it's debt, and then it'll come due in 30 years or 20 years. But in the meantime, we don't have to service it unless we happen to have a little bit of cash flow. So that's the other thing that, when I talked about 7 to 10 sources, it's typically tax credits, one, equity, and then a whole bunch of soft loans, city, county, state. And the convention is, I'm not sure how this happened decades ago, but they're almost always 3% simple interest loans that are deferred payment. So they kind of sit on the books, and the debt just tends to grow because usually we're not servicing it very much because there's not much cash flow. And since I'm talking to local government officials, I'll tell you what my personal opinion about what's so valuable about local money as opposed to tax credit or state loans is when you all are willing to put money in early on, it really helps us leverage the other sources, because the paradox we're trying to deal with all the time these days is funders say, we only want to fund shovel ready. Well, how do you get there? Someone's got to go first. And if we come up with a unicorn project, it meets what you're with, I'm sorry, I can't.
Napa County.
So we have a project hypothetically in Napa County that's a unicorn, and everything you wanted in the world is in that project. Location, who we're serving, whatever. If all the funders are saying we only want to fund you if you're shovel ready, we can't get that unicorn funded. So it's really helpful when local cities and counties will get money in early, so we can, when we go to get state loans or tax credits, we can say we have this much committed, and we get points for that. I mean, it's leverage and stuff. So that's the most important thing, in my personal opinion, about local government money is kind of giving birth to these things by getting in early. I think I'm almost out of time. Is that right? Okay. I've talked about Caritas, a few blocks from here. I'll just give you a flavor for how these funding sources, we call it the capital stack, that's our jargon. So how these capital sources stack up. So again, a 64 units downtown. The tax credit investment from Silicon Valley Bank was $21.7 million. And by the way, quick aside on tax credit details, your banks are interested in their return on investment from the tax gains, right? And for this project, our pro forma said we would be able to give them their tax benefits starting in 2022, but we got delayed with the lease-up process, and so we couldn't give them their tax benefits until 2023. And so our jargon, they did a downward adjuster. They took $400,000 back because they were expecting 2022 return, and we got delayed by a year. So these are not gifts or grants. These are business deals, and we lost some money because of the delay. At Caritas, we have an $8.9 million loan from the City of Santa Rosa that comes from the federal government. It was some CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding, that was allocated because of the disasters just for this area. Otherwise, they would never have anywhere near that amount of money. We also got a $1.9 million soft loan from the city in addition to the 8.9, which was some state program funding that is for offsites. So it was an infrastructure grant that the city got and for this project. So the next permanent source is Apple Corporation. Some years ago, Apple threw, I want to say $1 billion or $2 for Bay Area housing development. And they hooked up with Housing Trust Silicon Valley to administer that. So we got for Caritas Homes, we got a $2.1 million construction and permanent loan, does both. And that's a kind of a quirky thing because it's a hard loan. It's not deferred payment, pay if you can kind of thing. It's hard money, but it's only at 2%. So Apple said, yeah, we want this to be repaid, but below market rate. So that's kind of unusual. Yeah.
Is that through Apple, is that a fund that grows, is why they're getting charging the 2% so that they can continue to expand this, or for profit for Apple?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to that, but I don't. Caritas, we also got a $4.7 million soft loan from the state directly. It's called the No Place Like Home program, and that's a funding source just for homeless persons that have a psychiatric disability. So it's a mentally ill homeless person, and that's why we set aside 30 units for that population because of that funding source. We have $2.3 million in charitable gifts, $500,000 from the Silicon Valley Bank Foundation. They just made a philanthropic gift. And Providence made a gift of $1.8 million. Silicon Valley Bank, by the way, before they went belly up, they also did our construction loan. And so that's why they were so willing to give us the $500,000 gift, is because they were, doing the construction lending and also, by the way, buying the tax credits. So that I'll never forget that Monday morning I woke up and heard the news. Because the thing was half built at the time, and I was in a panic, but it all turned out to be great. So that's Caritas. If you're counting, that's 9 sources. So that my 7 to 10, this is 9 sources of funding. The building costs $44 million. That's $686,000 per unit, which might give you pause for some of you. That's what things cost.
What was that number again?
$686,000 per unit. Some of the things about that building that drove the cost up were, one, we did a full-blown environmental impact report, and we hired a CEQA attorney to project manage that. And so between the cost of the document itself, the environmental document, and the legal, it was, $300,000–400,000.
How many units per acre was that?
It's 87 or something. It's quite dense. Yeah, which is why another driver of the high cost was it has a parking structure on the interior of the building. So it's concrete podium construction, which is very, very expensive. That's probably the main reason this is so high, is we had to construct, because there's no room for surface parking. So we put the parking inside of the building, a little mini parking garage inside the building, and that's extremely expensive way to build, but it eliminated us having to have surface parking.
That's a quick question.
Yeah.
When did Santa Rosa do the citywide CEQA analysis? So hasn't that made it easier to put in housing and not have to worry about neighbors coming after you with a CEQA lawsuit?
It does.
Is this around the same time, or, I'm just curious if how much that has helped.
I think that effort came after we'd already,
Okay.
because we did our secret probably 5 years ago.
The downtown stationary specific plan is which I ran, and that was, I think, right after.
Yeah.
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 Right after.
I didn't talk about ownership projects, but I'm told I only have a couple minutes left. So let me just say very, very quickly, ownership is a totally different financing model, because what you're trying to do is figure out if the family you're trying to target, let's say 80% AMI, area median income, just making that up, that'd be a typical level for ownership. They can afford, a commercial loan of this much, but the project costs this much. So the gap you're trying to fill to make it possible for them to get into that house, you're going to rely on the jargon we call it is silent seconds. So subordinate loans, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 from different funding sources, that is debt for that family, but if they stay a certain amount of time, it's forgiven, or it rolls over more frequently. When they go to sell the property, there's some resale restrictions, and that money those soft loans, if you will, the secondary mortgages, will roll over to the next family. 5 or 6 years ago, before interest rates went up, these things would pencil out, these ownership projects. Right now, I don't think anyone's doing any because the amount that people can borrow commercially is so small that that gap to make it affordable is huge. And you'd probably end up with more soft seconds than you would the primary mortgage. So they penciled out 5 years ago when interest rates were, 3.5%, 4%, but they don't pencil out so well now. But it's a totally different model financially. So that's all I'll say about that, since I'm gabbing on too much and my time is up. They're going to get the big hook out here. So I didn't touch on, like I'd hoped to, the programming and targeting, but we kind of touched on that with some of your questions. So I'll just end there and see if there's any final questions.
I have one question, maybe you just answered it. So, for some municipalities, incremental development on smaller lots is all that's really viable, based on size, zoning, things like that. And I'm curious if the reason that doesn't happen is basically what you just said. It just doesn't pencil out for people to put like 10 units or less.
Yeah, the tax credit program in particular, there's so much cost with attorneys and specialists to put the thing together that if you're doing 10 units, that transaction cost is so high. Plus, you can't really attract banks who, they don't want to do all that underwriting and all that work for, $1 million, so yeah, they're just not very feasible.